Hello everybody and welcome to the latest episode of Urban Legends and Mythologies. On this episode we're actually diving into a subject that's been touched on in the past, but I've never really done a deep dive into it, and it's been kind of a while since I've done a post-World War II Cold War type episode, so I figured I better get on that. So on this episode we're discussing Operation Paperclip and the infamous Ratlines. And to help us out on our journey today, I am having a delicious Voodoo Ranger Juice Force IPA from New Belgium. They are the absolute best. They're not a sponsor, but this beer is so delicious that I'm willing to give it all the free advertising in the world. It's an amazing beer. You should try it. But with that aside, let's start at the beginning. So let's just simply ask the question, what was Operation Paperclip? So to put it as simply as possible, Paperclip was a secret United States intelligence program in which 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from former Nazi Germany to the US for government employment at the end of World War II. And you're probably already thinking, well, what's so special about that? It's a post-war devastated country. Of course, people are going to need employment. Well, what made it so secret was the nature of the work that these people were doing, and more specifically, who these people were and how they were affiliated with the Nazi Party. Put bluntly, a lot of these people were war criminals who should have been tried at Nuremberg and in Israel, but they ended up working for the United States Army, the CIA, the UK, MI6, and even the Soviet Union and the NKVD, which later became the KGB, and even in Soviet military and Soviet space program through their kind of own version of this known as Operation Osifagayam. And so for context, we're probably wondering, okay, why did we want these scientists and these engineers and whatnot? And it's because, to be perfectly blunt and honest, Germany has always been kind of a haven for scientific advancement. Some of the best scientists in the world were residing in Germany at this time, and we wanted those scientists to come to America because they had technology and knowledge of technology that we wanted. And we wanted to get our hands on this technology because we knew that if we didn't have it, then the Soviets were going to get it. And if the Soviets got it, then the entire history of the second half of the 20th century would have been different. And we would have fallen very behind in this upcoming rivalry known as the Cold War. So for context, this all kind of starts around the middle of the war, around 1942, when the Germans are being pushed back out of Russia after their failed attempt to conquer it, and now they have to fight a defensive war against the Russians. So what happens is the government, they recall all of their scientists and all of their engineers and technicians and anybody who's basically on the front line at the time. If you had a PhD or a master's degree, you were headed back to Germany because you were going to start research and development on new weapons technologies and stuff in order to wage this ongoing defensive war now. You know, all these scientists are serving in these various roles in the army, usually like logistical roles and stuff, truck drivers and whatnot. However, the regime needs them, so they have to go back to the lab and continue their work on whatever they were doing, whatever their expertise was. For context and for an example, 4,000 of the people who were on the front line were actually rocket scientists, and they were recalled to go work on your rocket science for the regime. So there's this vast influx of scientists who come in and they're working on new weapons technologies and new vehicles and I guess new uniforms or whatever they need in order to win this war. And it's not just engineering and rocket science. At the same time, during this war, we're seeing some of the most atrocious medical experiments in human history going on. These experiments are so disgusting, I don't really want to dive into them. I mean, they're literally crimes against humanity, but it's these perverse, sick, sadistic experiments in the medical community that are giving us an insight into things like biological warfare and disease and amputation and all this stuff. And it can be argued that, yeah, it was horrific, it should have never happened. However, that data was very valuable that came out of those experiments. So throughout the war, it's pushing these new technologies. We're seeing seeing new designs in armored equipment. We're seeing new synthetic rubbers and oil catalysts, which would be very important in the future, especially when it comes to rocketry. Speaking of rocketry, that's when the V-2 rocket was developed, and jet and rocket-propelled aircraft would be developed, as well as naval equipment, field radios, secret writing chemicals, aeromedicine research, gliders, and scientific and industrial personalities, which basically you have these scientists who are studying the effects of kind of the psychological effects of what would happen in these aircraft at the time, these rockets, these jets. You also have scientists who are studying pressurized suits and why that would be needed in these new types of aircrafts and in rockets when human spaceflight eventually became a thing. It wasn't a thing in the 40s, but they knew within the next 20-30 years or so it was going to become a thing, so they were already studying it. So at the time, Germany was very scientifically and technologically advanced. So essentially how it works is, so we had these lists of people, and these lists of people were the same lists of people that the Germans had when they recalled all their scientists back to Germany to work on these projects. So as we were conquering through France and Germany, we would be basically using these lists to basically track down these individuals and have them surrender to us, so basically eventually they could come work for us. However, it wasn't quite that simple. So as we advanced eastward through Europe, the writing was on the wall that the regime was going to fall, and a lot of these people were just escaping from Germany. They were leaving from Germany. They were heading to neutral territories mostly, and some were surrendering to the Americans and some were surrendering to the Soviets. However, more would surrender to the Americans because the ones that surrendered to the Soviets, they didn't have the best of times. So essentially what would happen is we would conquer some area, like some town, and then on the side of the town there'd be an airstrip or a lab or something, and we would have special divisions of guys who would like go into these labs and these warehouses and these chemical factories or whatever, and they'd be rounding up all the scientists and saying, okay, it's okay, we're gonna just put you in this little like detention center for a little while, and you're gonna bring all your research, and we're gonna get all your research, and you're gonna be fine, you're gonna come work for us. Or you can take your chances with the Soviets, and believe me, they're not gonna let you bring your families, and they're not gonna be kind to you. They'll probably put a bullet in your head if they don't find you all that useful. So essentially it's 1945, and we have these scientists kind of rounded up in these like little detention centers. There's one in Paris, there's one outside of Frankfurt, it's in Krasnburg Castle, and their family members are being housed in this housing camp in Bavaria. And what they're doing is they interrogate them, they're asking them what they did for the regime, and I imagine during this time they kind of start entering that denazification process because a lot of these people were prominent Nazis. And the denazification thing is kind of important because Truman, he states that no former member of the Nazi Party would be allowed to work in the United States in the government, and this creates kind of a hiccup for the whole operation because a lot of these scientists by default in order to work for the regime had to be a member of the Nazi Party. You couldn't get around that. It was a dictatorship, remember? So a lot of these records had to be fudged or doctored or just simply erased in order to kind of get around that. However, not all of these scientists would end up in the United States. A lot of them would end up in the Soviet Union, and that's mostly the scientists that were escaping to neutral countries who were continuing their research in these neutral countries. However, since it was in that Soviet sphere of influence, they would end up in the Soviet Union. At one point during Operation Osovakaya, 6,000 people in one night were transported to the Soviet Union to do work for that regime. And you know, the Soviets, they didn't really worry about the whole denazification thing. They were simply just like, you were rocket scientists in Germany, now you rocket scientists for Mother Russia. Here is your new lab, get to work, comrade. Daddy Stalin needs his rockets. So a lot of these scientists would remain in Europe for most of the rest of their life, but it was in 1945 when the first groups of these people started coming to the States. So in May 1945, the US Navy received into custody Herbert A. Wagner. He was the inventor of the HS-293 missile. This was a German radio-glided guide bomb, which was used to great effectiveness throughout the war. It was successfully used to damage or sink at least 25 ships, and it remained in use through 1944, when it was also used as an air-to-ground weapon to attack bridges in order to prevent the Allied breakout after the D-Day invasion. However, by then we got really good at jamming their radio signals, so at that stage it was pretty much useless and obsolete. However, this guy, he's the guy that invents it, and he's brought over to essentially keep working on that technology and perfecting it for us. And then in August 1945, Colonel Holger Tofte, he was the head of the rocket branch of the R&D division of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. He offered initial one-year contracts to rocket scientists coming out of Germany, and 127 of them accepted. By September 1945, the first group of 7 rocket scientists arrived at Fort Strong on Long Island in Boston Harbor. They included Werner von Braun, Erich Neubert, Theodor Popel, Wilhelm August Schultz, Abraham Rees, Wilhelm Jungert, and Walter Schwadicki, which sounds Polish. I don't know. And in late 1945, 3 rocket scientist groups arrived for duty at Fort Bliss, Texas, and at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico as War Department special employees. And the White Sands Proving Ground is really important because that's where we developed our missile technology. It's also where the Trinity test, the testing of the first atomic bomb, took place. And it was here that after the conclusion of World War II, a bunch of German V-2 rockets that were captured by the US were brought here and fired off between 1946 and 1951. And this rocket testing would not only lay the foundation of our intercontinental ballistic missile technology, but it would also lay the earliest foundations of what would become NASA. Because it was Werner von Braun who was a member of these groups of rocket scientists who would go on to be kind of the father of American spaceflight. He would go on to develop the Saturn V rocket, which would take us into space and eventually to the moon. He was a member of the Nazi Party. His membership number was 5,738,692, and he was also a colonel in the SS, number 185,068. Now, while he would later go on to downplay his involvement in the party, let's not forget that while he's developing this V-2 rocket, he was benefiting from slave labor during the war while developing it, so he does remain a controversial figure to this day, and that's all I'm really going to dive into on that. But I digress. Furthermore, between 1945 and 1952, the new United States Air Force sponsored the largest number of paperclip scientists, importing 260 men, of whom 36 eventually returned to Germany and 1 eventually immigrates to Argentina, which makes sense because the Air Force was extremely interested in the technology that the Germans were developing, because they were developing jet technology, and this was a new technology in the 40s. In particular, they were looking to get their hands on and reverse engineer the Messerschmitt Me-262, which was the first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft in the world, as well as the Rado AR-234 Blitz, which was the world's first operational turbojet-powered bomber. You know, jet technology was very new at this time, and the Americans knew that it was the future of flight, and they needed it, because essentially jet technology is still the backbone of our Air Force today, and without that jet technology, we would still be years behind. So a lot of people wonder, okay, so that's all good, so why was it a secret? Why did it remain a secret for so long? And it really comes back to the mindset right after World War II of, you know, we just conquered this great evil empire. Do we really want the people who worked for that empire and worked for that regime next door? I'm sure the last thing a lot of Americans wanted to hear in the 50s and 60s, that the heads of NASA and a lot of people who were holding some very serious positions within the Central Intelligence Agency were former Nazis. So despite the benefit that we gained all this new technology and we didn't have to waste years reverse engineering it, and better yet, we were getting an edge over on the Soviets, it still for the most part remained this kind of open secret. Plus, at the crux of this, it wasn't really all about the scientific technology we were gathering. We were also gathering some very serious intelligence concerning the Soviet Union, because we also brought over a number of Germans who were spies via the Ratlines Ratlines, which is the next subject I'll get into. And these people in these positions already had a background of gathering intelligence on the Soviet Union and suspected communists. And with communism on the rise across Eastern Europe, these were valuable members of the party to bring over, because we would then use them as spies in our own spy agencies here in the West to spy on the Soviets during the Cold War. And I'll get into that now. So for context, the Ratlines, they were kind of reserved for the worst of the worst. These weren't the people who were the scientists who were surrendering peacefully to the Americans. These were the people who had committed war crimes and atrocities, and they were on the run because they were facing the noose. And we're probably wondering who in the world would allow these monsters to escape to other countries, and what countries would actually want these people. And a lot of the countries that wanted these people were fascist dictatorships. Because remember, fascism is a form of government, and it's a very common form of government, especially in the middle of the 20th century. And also a lot of neutral countries were part of this too. So for example, Francoist Spain, it was a dictatorship and it was neutral during the war. They were taking in hundreds of war criminals through the Ratlines. Some of them would flee to places like Switzerland, which was also neutral in the war. There were some who fled to the Middle East. They actually fled to Syria, but the vast majority of them would end up in South America, particularly in Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, and most famously Argentina. And this was all orchestrated through the Catholic Church because, you know, when the worst atrocities on the planet happens, the Catholic Church usually isn't too far away. And yes, if I do have any Catholic listeners left after all the trashing I do to that institution, yeah, I do apologize, but I will drag that institution through the mud every chance I get. I do not respect that institution. But enough Catholic bashing. Let's get into the Ratlines and why they even existed in the first place. So as we know, there were a lot of neutral countries during World War II, and a lot of these countries had dictatorships. That's kind of why they were neutral, and they kind of admired the dictatorship of Germany at the time. And a lot of these countries, they didn't quite have modern developed economies yet. You know, they wanted to advance in science and industry and stuff. So they looked towards that German model for that advancement, and who better to advance that stuff than Germans? So a lot of these nations had their own version of Operation Paperclip. They wanted to bring in science and industry and research and modernize their economy on this model. But a lot of these countries didn't have direct involvement in the war. They kind of sat the war out. So instead of getting all the scientists that the Americans and the Soviets were cherry picking, they had to get the rest, kind of in the hopes that they would get their hands on some of these people that the Americans and the Soviets didn't get their hands on. And Argentina was a particular hotbed in this because Argentina has always been kind of a destination for German immigration. So they already had kind of a German population that they could assimilate into. And they had Juan Perón, who was a dictator who wanted these people to come in and help modernize his country and his economy. And Juan Perón kind of had this almost delusional but not so delusional idea that the Americans and the Soviets were going to eventually come to war, and they thought that they could emerge as a third great power if they mediated things in between the two superpowers. However, that never really happens for Argentina. After Juan Perón's death, it remains kind of politically unstable throughout most of the 20th century. They never really reach that apex of prominence. They actually kind of get overshadowed by Brazil towards the end of the 20th century. And for most of the rest of the 20th century, the Americans and the Soviets pretty much ignore anybody in their like 40 plus year long pissing contest for supremacy. And a lot of other nations that are going to accept these people, they kind of have that same mindset, which is why they kind of scatter like rats across the Western world. And even some former members of the Wehrmacht end up in the French Foreign Legion because, you know, the French Foreign Legion kind of has that reputation of being the place where you can go to forget your past. However, that would never happen today. In fact, if you're a war criminal or any kind of criminal today, they'll never accept you. But I digress. So the origins of the first Ratlines are actually connected to various developments in Vatican-Argentine relations before and during World War II. It's actually as early as 1942 when Roman Cardinal Luigi Maglione, at the behest of Pope Pius XII, contacted an ambassador ambassador of Argentina regarding that country's willingness to generously accept European Catholic immigrants in a timely manner, allowing them to live and work. Also in the same year, a German priest named Anton Weber, he was the head of Rome's Society of St. Raphael. He traveled to Portugal, which was neutral, with the intentions to continue to Argentina, seemingly to lay the groundwork for Catholic immigration and subsequently German immigration. Now, Catholic leaders, they actually had a reason for wanting to work with these Nazis. It was because they were trying to resist the rise of Bolshevism, Soviet doctrine in the West, because with Soviet doctrine came atheism. So with atheism, the church wouldn't matter, so they're trying to preserve the church, their most sacred institution, blah blah blah, Jesus and their God and their power over the millions of people that they have in the world. So by 1944, the writing was already on the wall for the Germans. They were going to lose this war, and the Ratline activity really focused on Francoist Spain, which was a neutral dictatorship at the time, and it was through Spain where the first of these people were fleeing from Europe. So by late 1945, early 1946, there were hundreds of war criminals in Spain, as well as thousands of former Nazis and fascists who were fleeing, the Americans and the Soviets in Germany, and they're essentially seeking asylum in these Catholic churches and Catholic monasteries and basically waiting for their documents to come through so they can flood into the Americas, because their only alternative at the time was to be tried as a war criminal and face the noose like a man, but these rats, they're fleeing. And this isn't like a secret. This actually pisses off the United States Secretary of State at the time. He was a man named James F. Burns, and he said that these asylum seekers, who I remind you are all fascists and war criminals, essentially just being protected by the Catholic Church instead of actually facing the consequences of their actions, because the Pope at the time is so worried about communism that he would rather flood the New World with a bunch of fucking Nazis than to actually cooperate with the US. But it gets even more disgusting. So there's this Austrian Catholic bishop named Alias Hodel, who was a Nazi sympathizer. So he was the rector of the Pontificio Instituto Tecnicio Santa Maria del Amia in Rome. I don't know, I don't speak Italian. Hell, I can barely speak English. What do you want from me? But this was a seminary for Austrian and German priests where he was the spiritual director of the German people resident in Italy. And at the end of the war in Italy, Hodel became active in ministering to these German-speaking prisoners of war and internees in the POW camps. And in true Catholic fashion, he would actually go on to bitch about the conditions in these POW camps, while completely ignoring the fact that the men that he would go on to help were the commanders of some of the most notorious concentration camps of the war. And he would use his position in order to aid the escape of wanted Nazi war criminals, including Franz Stangl, who was the commanding officer of Treblinka, Gustav Wagner, who was the commanding officer of Sobibor, Alois Brunner, who was responsible for the Drancy internment camp near Paris and was in charge of deportations in Slovakia to German concentration camps, Erich Priebig, who was responsible for the Adriatine massacre, and Adolf Eichmann, who was the infamous architect of the Holocaust. This dickbag helped all those monsters escape. He would give them false identity documents from the Vatican Refugee Organization, which they would later use to apply for a displaced person's passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And basically once they had that, they were able to travel overseas. It was as good as any other passport. And he was essentially the head of an illicit trade in stolen and forged International Committee of the Red Cross visas. And this doesn't always come up, but I'm sure he's getting some kind of payment for procuring these documents, because remember, during World War II, the Germans looted billions of dollars in art and gold and silver and diamonds and jewelry and anything you can think of, and a lot of that stuff had never been recovered. Well, I can tell you exactly where that stuff is. It's in those monasteries. The Catholic Church has all that stuff now because they were paying the Catholic Church in order to help them escape. Now, they weren't just walking up to these monasteries with all this loot in their arms. No, a lot of them knew where that stuff was, and they would say, okay, you get me these papers, you get me out of the country, you get me into the New World, I'll give you the location of that treasure that's buried somewhere, or that gold, or that artwork, I'll give you this apartment address where I stashed all this artwork, or whatever. I'm convinced that that's where most of those stolen treasures ended up. They ended up in the churches, and you know how secretive the Catholic Church is. They're never going to tell you whether or not they have that stuff. But when you really think about it, you know it's true. Because honestly, a lot of those looted works have never been recovered. And you would think that after 80 plus years, some of that looted work or that looted gold or whatever would turn up in a bank vault or in private collections, but it never has. So it makes perfect sense that the Catholic Church has these looted documents, this looted art, this looted jewelry, etc., etc. And Bishop Hidell, he was just one of these people within the Catholic Church who was operating this rat line. He was actually a very small player in it. A major Roman rat line was operated by a small but influential network of Croatian priests, members of the Franciscan order, and they were led by a Father Krunoslav Draganovic. And they were essentially doing the same thing that Hidell did, however they had more of that yes, wink, and a nod from the Catholic Church in order to do it. And a lot of the focus on this was more of pro-fascist Croats and Serbs and some Hungarians and Austrians who were living in Eastern Europe at the time. And it said that through this route they funneled thousands upon thousands of pro-fascist former Nazis through Rome, through France, and into the New World. And it operated as kind of an open secret throughout Rome and Italy. In fact, the US were aware of this rat line and actually used it for their own purposes. And it kind of rolls back into Operation Paperclip, because remember, at the same time, there is the Soviets in this area too, and they're also hunting for these same people to employ in their programs. So there's this real spy versus spy situation going on in post-fascist Italy as early as 1945. The last real network I'm really going to just touch on a little bit is the infamous Odessa network. That was actually created by Germans. It was created by the SS in 1946 in order to get them into Rome and get them into Spain and eventually get them over to places like Argentina. And I'm not really going to deep dive too much into it here because that subject has enough information it could garner its own episode, but it essentially had the same end goals as the rest of these rat lines. So let's shift the focus now away from the rat line organizations themselves to the people who were able to escape via these rat lines and what eventually became of them. And I'm going to include the lives of people who came to the Americas through Operation Paperclip itself, because Paperclip was basically another rat line if you really think about it. So let's start with the most famous person to come out of this, Wernher von Braun. He was the father of American spaceflight and was prominent in the creation of NASA. So von Braun was by trade a rocket scientist. He was the one who developed the V-2 rocket. So early in 1945, the Soviet Army is actually about 100 miles from where him and his staff is, and he actually assembles his planning staff and he asks them to decide to whom should they surrender. They decide to surrender to the Americans because they figured they'll probably have a better time with the Americans than the Soviets. I bet the conversation was probably, hey, do you want to end up with the Americans and probably end up in the land of freedom and riches, or do you want to go freeze your ass off in Moscow sitting in one of Papa Stalin's bread lines? So basically the story is he surrenders, the US Intelligence Corps gets a hold of him, he tells them where all these documents are that will tell him how to build V-2 rockets and all their research and whatnot, and he would essentially get a free ticket to come to America to work for the United States Army in further development of these rockets. So initially he's sent to the White Sands Proving Grounds to further the work on the V-2 rockets, and then by 1952 he's actually sent to Huntsville, Alabama, which would actually become his home for the next 20 years, where he leads the Army's rocket development team, where they developed the Redstone rocket, which was the first live nuclear ballistic missile. From that, they go on to develop the Jupiter-C rocket, which becomes the basis for the Juno 1 rocket, which successfully launched the West's first satellite Explorer 1 on 31 January 1958, and it signaled the birth of America's space program. The Explorer 1 was basically America's answer to Sputnik, because the year previously the Soviets launched Sputnik, and it creates this panic amongst Americans, which propels us into this space race. And you can hear all about that on my previous episodes. That really janky first episode I ever did on the lost cosmonaut theories, and then the kind of continuation of that, the return to the lost cosmonaut theories, or whatever I called it. Those are in previous episodes, check them out. The audio's not the best, I was very amateurish back then, but if you're interested in the subject of the early space race, go back and give those ones a listen. They are actually pretty great. And it's also in the 50s where he really starts laying the foundations for NASA, along with the Army and the Congress and whatever. And in order to get public support of this, because in America you need public support, it's all done through our tax dollars, he actually teams up with Walt Disney and creates a series of films with Walt Disney explaining why America needs to invest in a space program. He already had plans for space stations, for moon flights, for a moon base, and for even heading to Mars. So eventually in 1958 NASA becomes a thing, and he is made NASA's engineering program manager, and he becomes the chief architect of the Apollo Saturn V rocket. Eventually, by early 1970, him and his family relocate to Washington, D.C., where he was assigned the post of NASA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Planning at NASA headquarters. But due to budget constraints and some changing attitudes at NASA towards some of the projects, he eventually retires in 1972. After which he works for the aerospace company Fairchild Industries, and he works with them basically until his death of kidney cancer, I believe, in 1977. And he's buried in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, throughout the rest of his life, he always did downplay his involvement with the Nazi regime, but it was well known that he did benefit from slave labor due to labor shortages in Germany towards the end of the war, and he never did really pay for those crimes, nor did he ever apologize for them. However, it can be argued that without him and the teams of engineers that he brought along, that our knowledge of rocketry would be still years behind, maybe even decades, where it currently is, and who knows, maybe it would be the Soviet Union who has a flag up there on the moon as opposed to the Americans. So let's get into somebody a little more notorious now. This is a man who should have never benefited from the Ratlines. He probably would have faced punishment for his crimes a lot sooner if US intelligence hadn't been involved. This is the story of the escape of the Butcher of Lyon, also known as Klaus Barbie. So Barbie was a German officer in the SS, and he worked in Vichy, France, in the area of Lyon, and basically his job was to suppress the French resistance and collect intelligence on the French resistance, which he did through brutal torture. He would eventually move on to teach these techniques to other people in other regimes throughout his life. So this actually starts in 1947. He was recruited as an agent for the 66th Detachment of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, along with a Serbian agent of the Belgrade Special Police. Now, the reason why they were recruited was because they were looking for him as well as other SS officers who could stem the rise of communism influence in Europe at the time. They also wanted him because he had knowledge of British interrogation techniques, mostly because he was on the other side of those British interrogation techniques, and they also wanted to know about any identities of former SS officers that British intelligence might be recruiting, because even though we're allies, we don't always share intelligence information with each other. The US also used him to report on French intelligence activities in the French zone of occupied Germany because they suspected that the French had been infiltrated by the KGB. Now, at this time, the French were kind of pissed at us because when they found out that we had Barbie, they were like, hand him over to us, he's a war criminal, he needs to go on trial for his crimes against humanity against the French resistance in the war. And the Americans, they're just like, no, we need him for some counterintelligence operations that we're performing against the Soviets. years. And instead of handing this war criminal over to France, they send him to Bolivia via the Ratlines, via U.S. counterintelligence and the Catholic Church. Now, the CIC would later assert that they did this because Barbie knew too much about the network of German spies that the CIC had planted in various European communist organizations, and it was suspicious of communist influence in France. So to avoid him eventually getting captured and spilling the beans on all these German moles within these intelligence organizations, they basically send him to Bolivia. So, fresh out of the Ratlines, Barbie immigrates to Bolivia in 1951, and he lived well for 30 years in the city of Cochabamba. And Cochabamba is actually a really beautiful city. It's high up in the Andes, and it has these beautiful views. I think it's like the 4th largest city in Bolivia. It's kind of in like central Bolivia, and it's kind of known as the eternal spring because it kind of experiences spring-like temperatures year-round due to where it is on the earth. It's really awesome. But I digress. So this is where they send this guy, and pretty much as soon as he gets there, he starts cozying up with these high-ranking Bolivian officials, including Bolivian dictators Hugo Banzar and Luis Garcia Meza, and it's through these new influential friends where he gets involved in some arms trade organizations, and it's actually through that where he's eventually appointed to the rank of lieutenant colonel within the Bolivian armed forces. So he eventually goes on to collaborate with Rene Barrentino's regime, in which he teaches the general's private paramilitaries how to torture and how torture can best be used in interrogation techniques, and they use this to great effect in suppressing leftist groups because remember, in South America, communism was a very popular ideology that was spreading around, and these dictatorships were very worried about that. Later, in collaboration with General Banzar, he assists in illegal arrests, interrogations, and murders of opposition and progressive groups. So he's basically fallen back into his old habits and repeating the same atrocities that he committed in Lyon against the French resistance. This time he's just doing it against left-wing groups and communists. And furthermore, he was also strongly linked to the neo-Nazi paramilitary member Alvaro de Castro, who he was personally hired as a bodyguard, and the two participated in criminal actions and businesses together. They had powerful connections to drug lords, and they would sell them illegal weapons. So evenly at this time, as late as the 1970s, he's actively and openly still a Nazi. But everybody's like, oh, well, we need him in the fight against communism, so okay, whatever. And in the meantime, France is still sitting there, and they're like, we want this guy back. He's a war criminal. He deserves the noose. What's going on? And later, he even goes on to work with Pablo Escobar, providing security from the raw cocoa leaf to the facilities where it would be manufactured into cocaine, in which in exchange Escobar would fund his anti-communist activities in Bolivia. Now, the whole time he's doing this, there's public outcry, especially in France and across the world at this point, because this war criminal is known to be living in this area and collaborating with these people, yet no one's willing to arrest or extradite him back to France to stand trial. However, finally in 1983, under the newly elected democratic government of Hernan Silas Zuzazo, they arrest Barbie in La Paz on the pretext of his owing the government $10,000 US for goods that he was supposed to have delivered but did not, probably weapons, and he's finally extradited back to France to finally face trial for his crime. And after some reports are released in the early 80s, the US finally apologizes to France for allowing this guy to escape for 33 years, and France is like, well, it's about fucking time. So after all this, he's finally indicted on 41 separate accounts of crimes against humanity based on the depositions of 730 Jews and French resistance survivors who described how he tortured and murdered his prisoners. And on July 4th, 1987, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, where he would die 4 years later in prison in Lyon of leukemia and spine and prostate cancer at the age of 77. The next character who makes his way to South America is one of the most brutal, horrible monsters to ever live. He was a name who would come up several times during the Nuremberg trials, and for a time was like one of the most wanted men in the world, the infamous Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect of the Holocaust. This was a man who was responsible for crimes against humanity on a scale that had never been seen before. Now, he was actually captured by US forces and spent some time in several camps for SS officers. However, he was using forged papers that identified him as Otto Eckmann, and he escaped from a work detail at Cham, Germany, family when he realized that his identity had been discovered. So he obtains new identity papers with the name of Otto Heiniger, and after this he relocates frequently. He eventually leases a small plot of land in Altensalzkoth, and he finds work in the forestry industry, where he remains in virtual anonymity until about 1950. Now, during the whole time, his name is the one that is always coming up during the Nuremberg trials, especially when considering the Holocaust. It's always his name that comes up. So there's this worldwide manhunt for him, and he's essentially just living this mild-mannered life in Germany the whole time, right under their noses. So in 1948, he obtains a landing permit for Argentina in false identification under the name of Ricardo Clement through an organization directed by Bishop Hadel, that sick Nazi collaborator who ran his own Ratline. And using these documents, he was able to eventually obtain an International Committee of the Red Cross humanitarian passport and the remaining entry permits, and in 1950 he was allowed immigration into Argentina. And remember, at the time, the Perón regime wanted German immigration. They wanted their science and their technology and all that fun stuff, and they kind of liked the fact that they had an anti-communist bent to them. So in 1950 he travels across Europe, and he stays in a series of monasteries which were set up as safe houses, and he departs from Genoa by ship on 17 June 1950 and arrives in Buenos Aires on July 14th. So he initially works as a government contractor, and by 1952 he sends for his family and they all move to Buenos Aires, and he's initially working in these low-paying jobs until he finally gets employment at Mercedes-Benz, where he rises to the position of department head, and he eventually builds a house at 14 Garibaldi Street. It's now 6061 Garibaldi Street, and they moved in 1960. So here he is. This cruel, sadistic monster is just a mild-mannered guy working as a department head at Mercedes-Benz in Buenos Aires, living with his family and just continuing on with his life like nothing ever happened. Of course, it wasn't entirely a secret as to who this guy was, because in late 1956, a journalist named Wilhelm Sassen, who was looking to write a biography about the guy, actually tracks him down and interviews him over the course of 4 months. And the audio recordings didn't become public until 2022, in which he confesses that he knew of the fact that millions of Jews and others were being killed, and he didn't care about the fact that they were being deported to Auschwitz. In his mind, they either lived or they died. It wasn't up to him. He simply said those who were fit to work worked, and those who weren't were sent to the final solution. And I just have to digress for a second. Sometimes reading and repeating some of this history just makes me sick. However, we don't study history to feel good about ourselves. We study history to understand what happened and to understand why certain aspects of it should never be repeated. However, these articles, they were actually used as the basic for a series of articles that appeared in Life and Stern magazines in late 1960, and these tapes actually went on to form the basis of a documentary series called The Devil's Confession, the Lost Eichmann tapes, which appeared on Israeli television in 2022. However, we would get some little hint of justice, because as early as 1953, the infamous Nazi hunter and Holocaust survivor Simon Wiesenthal, who was a dude who dedicated his life to hunting down these fuckers and bringing them to justice, he gets on the trail of some solid evidence that suggests that this guy might be in Argentina, and he actually sends that evidence to Mossad. Now, Mossad is Israel's kind of version of the CIA. It's their intelligence agency, and they have no problem trying to track down these fucking assholes. So Mossad gets a hold of this information, and along with some other information that they had on this person named Lothar Hermann, who was a Jewish German immigrant who had immigrated to Argentina in 1938. His daughter Sylvia was dating a man named Klaus Eichmann in 1956, who was boasting about his father's Nazi exploits and bullshit, and he actually sends his daughter on a fact-finding mission where she was met at the door by Eichmann himself. So in 1957, this information gets passed on to Mossad, and Mossad sends operatives out, and at first they're just conducting surveillance. However, by 1960, they were able to confirm the identity of this man. However, Israel didn't have an extradition treaty with Argentina, and Argentina was very touchy about turning over these former Nazis to them. A lot of the time, their requests would just get denied. So the question becomes, how do we get a hold of this guy? We're gonna have to create an international incident, I guess. The legal ways aren't working, and this asshole needs to stand trial for his crimes against humanity. So without any other option, they basically just have to kidnap him. So they put together this 8-man team, and their basic goal is to just surveil and watch him and figure out his daily routine. So after days of surveillance, they realize that he pretty much gets home by bus every day at around the same time. And they plan to capture him as he's walking from the bus stop to his house near this open field. However, on the day of the capture, he actually shows up about a half hour late, and they almost abandon the plan. So he eventually does show up, and one of the agents walks up to him and asks him if he has a minute in Spanish. And this initially frightens him, and he attempts to leave, but right when he attempts to leave, 2 other agents jump out and grab him. They wrestle him to the ground, and they get him into the car, and they speed off to this Mossad safe house that they had set up. So they keep him there for like 9 days, and I assume they're interrogating him and double checking his identity and just making sure that they got the right guy. They finally got this guy. So after 9 days of interrogation, they drug him, dress him as a flight attendant, they put him on a flight, and they send him back to Israel. And of course, this starts an international incident, and Argentina's pissed off because they feel like their sovereignty's been violated. But eventually, Israel and Argentina, they come to this kind of mutual agreement, and they decide to drop the dispute. So he's finally put on trial on 11 April 1961, and he is indicted on 15 criminal charges, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in a criminal organization. And he was sentenced to death by hanging. He was hanged for his crimes just slightly after midnight on June 1st, 1962, and much deservedly so. The last of these monsters is probably the most cruel and most horrifying one of all, and the one who actually got away, the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. He was the doctor who performed horrific experiments at Auschwitz II-Birkenau throughout the war, and him, along with another team of doctors, would also decide who would go to the gas chambers. He would conduct all kinds of insane human experiments on this pool of prisoners that he just had open access to. He would deliberately infect people with deadly diseases like typhus. He would amputate limbs. He would create wounds in people and infect them in order to study how the infections would spread. He would inject dyes into people's eyes in order to see if it would change the color, and a various host of other horrific experiments. So in 1945, as the regime was falling, he actually makes his way to Czechoslovakia disguised as a Wehrmacht officer. There he temporarily entrusted his documents to a nurse with whom he had struck up a relationship, after which he and his team, they decide to head west to escape the Soviets. They're eventually captured by the Americans. However, due to the disorganization of the Allies regarding the distribution of wanted lists and the fact that he didn't have the usual SS blood group tattoo, he was released at the end of July and eventually obtains false papers under the name of Fritz Ullmann. He later alters that to the name Fritz Holman, and after several months on the run, including a trip back to the Soviet-occupied area to recover his Auschwitz records, he eventually finds work near Rosenheim as a farmhand. However, he's known now, and he's convinced that his capture would result in a trial and a death sentence. So in 1949, he uses the Ratlines to escape from Germany to Argentina. So he gets to Buenos Aires, and he's working as a carpenter while lodging in a boarding house. However, after a few weeks, he moves into the house of a sympathizer in a more affluent neighborhood. He then works as a salesman for his family's farm equipment company called Carl Mengele & Sons, and in 1951, he begins making frequent trips to Paraguay as a regional sales representative. After this, he moves into an apartment in Buenos Aires, and he uses funds from his family to buy a part interest in a carpentry concern, and then rented a house in the suburb of Olivis in 1954. It's also stated that at the time he was most likely working as kind of a private doctor under the table performing abortions and stuff, since he would have been unlicensed in Argentina. But I guess this guy was capable of exuding arrogance because he was actually able to obtain a copy of his birth certificate through the West German Embassy in 1956, and he was issued an Argentine foreign residence permit under his real name. He then uses this document to obtain a West German passport using his real name and embarked on a trip to Europe. So yeah, I don't know if that's arrogance or just him thinking that maybe nobody's looking for him, but he's using his real name. So he meets up with some family, they go on a ski resort trip to Switzerland, and they even go to his hometown, and then he eventually returns to Argentina. He eventually brings some of his family over, and while at one point when he's performing an abortion, a teenage girl dies, and he's asked about practicing medicine without a license, and this brings up this fear that maybe this will expose his past at Auschwitz. So he keeps his story kind of vague, and they just kind of let him off with a slap on the wrist. Well, after this, he takes an extended holiday to Paraguay, where he becomes a citizen of Paraguay in 1959. And this couldn't have actually come at a better time for him, because at the time, Wiesenthal, he and other agencies were looking into this man, Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, because his name had been mentioned several times at the Nuremberg trial, and a lot of people just assumed that he was dead. However, they were basically able to trace him to Argentina. However, Argentina couldn't extradite him because he no longer lived at that address. He was already living in Paraguay. So later in life, he lives under several aliases in Paraguay and Brazil, and he kind of spends the rest of his life farming and then living in Brazil. In the 70s, his health starts to deteriorate, and he's suffering from these strokes, and finally one day while slimming, he has a stroke and dies, unfortunately never being brought to justice for his crimes. And according to his son, he dies unrepentant, because about 2 years before his death in 1979, he visits his father, and he says that all he saw was just this old unrepentant Nazi who claimed that he only carried out his duties as an officer and that he never personally harmed anyone. So those are just a few of the stories that came from Operation Paperclip and the Ratlines, and trust me, there are thousands upon thousands more. And to be honest, a vast majority of these people were never brought to justice for their crimes, and some of them were just unrepentant to the end. They didn't believe in their minds that they were doing anything wrong when they committed those atrocities. But that brings us to the question, why did they exist in the first place? And I think we already answered that earlier. They existed because we wanted a bastion against the rise of communism in Europe at the time and throughout the world. South America was a hotbed for communism throughout the latter half of the 20th century, and it's kind of crazy to think that we would cozy up with a bunch of fascists in order to kind of stem the rise of communism rather than just, I don't know, working with the communists to have some kind of peace or whatever. But thus was the nature of the Cold War. It was just a dick-waving contest between two superpowers for superiority, and we were going to use whatever means necessary in order to gain supremacy, even if that meant embracing a bunch of fucking fascists. And to be honest, I don't really know how to end this episode on a really positive note. This is a very heavy subject, and a subject that a lot of people aren't really comfortable with when they unveil the true history behind it. I mean, sure, we have the urban legends surrounding it and the myths, but when you dive into the real history of it, you really see a lot of atrocious stuff, and you wonder how humans can make those decisions, and then you wonder how America, which was supposed to be the bastion for good, can get itself involved and entangled in those people that made those horrific decisions. But I guess that leads to the ultimate question of what if? What if we didn't develop this program and these rat lines in order to get these people into the Americas? How different would the world be today? Or would it be any different? It's such a gray area, and unfortunately life is made up of those gray areas. Sometimes things aren't just black and white, it's always in shades of gray. But at the end of the day, this is the world and this is the timeline in which we live in. Unfortunately, you don't get to pick your world or your timeline. History can be a tough subject sometimes, and to be honest, I never would have done this deep dive into it if it wasn't for a fan request or several fan requests for this particular subject. And with that being said, I think I will end it here today. Once again, this is Mike, this is Urban Legends and Mythologies, and if for some reason you were actually entertained by this really gloomy episode, all I ask is that you maybe tell a friend about this podcast you're listening to. This podcast is kind of a niche genre. Urban legends and mythology, anthropology, history, stuff like that doesn't really show up very high in the charts, so the primary growth of it really is by word of mouth, and that is through you listeners. listeners. Or as always, if you want to support the podcast directly, you can sign up and donate in that link in the description. It's as little as 99 cents a month. I think it goes up to like $10 a month, or you can donate whatever you want. It's really up to you. That does really go into helping the show out, and it really does influence my decisions on topics. For instance, this was a fan requested topic from fans who actually donated money to that little donation thing, so I'm going to be a little biased there sometimes unless it's a subject I'm really personally interested in. And don't worry if you are kind of sick of the doom and gloom. The next few episodes are going to be a little more lighthearted, a little more fun. Let's just say we're not going to be talking about war crimes or Cold War shenanigans for a while. We're actually getting into Halloween season, so I got some awesome stuff planned for that. But I am rambling right now, so I'm going to finish off this. I'm going to edit it. I'm going to have a few beers because I'm on vacation right now, and I need to spend some time at the tiki bar. So I thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.